Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're about to embark on a journey to a place sometimes called the Switzerland of Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
But its history and its present, well, they're far more complex, more dramatic than maybe that nickname suggests.
Absolutely. We're diving deep into Kyrgyzstan today, using this really fascinating source you've shared, A Brief History of Kyrgyzstan.
Right.
And it's not just, dry history. It's a proper scholarly overview, geography, earliest humans, empires, independence, modern challenges. It's all in there.
So our mission here is to unpack all of that with you. We want to pull out the key insights, maybe the surprising bits, and connect the dots so we can all understand what makes Kyrgyzstan. Well, Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, let's do it. Where should we start? The landscape seems fundamental.
Exactly. The source kicks right off with geography, and you can see why immediately. It's landlocked, Central Asia, bordering Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China. Standard stuff so far.
But then the mountains. Wow.
Yeah, get this. 91% of the country is above 1,500 meters.
91%.
And almost a third is above 3,000 meters. So you're looking at a place where only about a quarter is flat valleys.
Mm-hmm.
The rest, foothills and just sheer mountains.
That creates this incredible altitude range. The source mentions it goes from over 7,400 meters high down to, 133 meters below sea level?
Yeah, below sea level in some spots. It's wild.
And the source breaks down the key areas. You've got the Fergana Valley, the Talas and Chatkal Ridges, the massive central Tian Shan, the Pamir Alai.
In the Karakul Basin with Issyk-Kul Lake.
The Warm Lake.
Right, which is kind of amazing given the surrounding peaks.
It really is. And the vegetation changes dramatically with the height. Grasslands, steps down low.
Then pine woods, walnuts, saxall, that desert tree, juniper.
Right, until you hit the permanent ice and snow, about 7% of the country covered in ice.
Okay, so why dwell in the mountains? Because as you said, it's fundamental. For you listening, this geography isn't just backdrop. It shaped everything.
Absolutely. Where people could settle, how trade routes developed or didn't.
How easily invaders could get in, how different cultures popped up in different valleys. It's like destiny written on the land.
So from that dramatic stage, the source takes us way, way back. Section 3 talks about the earliest human presence. We're talking lower Paleolithic hominids.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago. Places like Chongkimin, Suleiman II.
Yeah, and middle Paleolithic sites too, like Akshabir. Then upper Paleolithic folks using obsidian tools, probably down in the foothills and plains where it was a bit easier going.
And as things warmed up in the Holocene, you get Mesolithic, Bronze Age people, starting to form early farming groups.
Mm-hmm. The source points to these early settled cultures connected to places like Turkestan and Kashgar.
And these weren't just simple camps. The Serembek culture, for instance, they had grain farming, metalworking, pottery. The source mentions ancient settlements dating back to the 6th, 5th centuries BC.
Yes, and here's a key insight from the source. The nomadic Kyrgyz people, who come into the picture later, they actually learned about settled life and farming from these earlier groups.
Ah, so interaction right from the start. It mentions Uzbek, Tajik, in Kak cultures specifically.
Exactly. So it wasn't just nomads sweeping in. There was exchange. You see towns developing later with the Sog culture, 7th and 9th centuries.
And the archaeology backs this up. Burial mounds, gold artifacts in the Chui Valley, Oghuz fortresses, those balls.
The balls, those stone figures. Really interesting. They show connections across the whole steppe region. Like the Issyk Golden Man burial, technically in Kazakhstan, but part of that same cultural world.
So the big takeaway for you here is Kyrgyzstan's history is incredibly deep, layers upon layers. It wasn't just nomads. Settled life was there early, interacting, building a foundation.
And that interaction, that location, it leads straight into Section 4. The Silk Road. Kyrgyzstan is the center of the Great Silk Road.
It's easy to picture one road, isn't it? But the source describes this whole network, active even before the Common Era. Nomads trading with settled people.
And migrating tribes moving through actually helped, kind of accidentally, to expand trade routes.
Right. And during the Arab Caliphate, this wasn't just about silk and spices. It was a massive crossroads for ideas, religion, technology.
Mm-hmm. Culture moving back and forth. The source notes routes shifted over time, maybe moving south later, but new branches opened up connecting to Eurasia.
Yeah, it mentions a later route, 12th, 14th centuries, linking like Czechs, Kyrgyz, and Kalmyks. Shows how dynamic it was.
And politics played a huge role, of course. Merchant groups, kingdoms like the Huns, they all influenced the routes. But even with turmoil, this Middle Eurasian system, as the source calls it, persisted. Geography kept it connected.
So what this shows you is that Kyrgyzstan wasn't just on the Silk Road. It was a hub, a nexus. The mountains made things hard, but they also created these crucial corridors for exchange that shaped civilizations way beyond its borders, a kind of ancient globalization.
Definitely. Now let's zoom in on the Kyrgyz people themselves. Section 5 talks about their origins and culture. First written mentions are around the 1st century AD, a nomadic tribal union.
And the source traces them moving from the Altai Mountains down towards the Irtysh and Yenisei rivers, right around the start of the Common Era. And we get some really vivid details from, was it a Roman historian?
Yes, really specific stuff. Living in wooden huts. Painting faces with vermin blood, maybe ritual.
Or just decoration, who knows? Using fire for managing plants, having huge flocks.
And a diet heavy on animal products. Blood, milk, butter, cream. Pretty standard for pastoral nomads, but the detail is striking.
And later, 6th, 7th centuries, more specific customs. Trimming foreheads in temples, tattooing faces with dots.
They also adapted their movements, setting up specific winter pastures, Shuga near China, trading camels for lambs, smart adaptation.
The source also briefly notes the Turkic invasion starting in the 6th century, which, added another layer to the region's mix.
Right. So for you listening, this section gives a real tangible sense of the early Kyrgyz identity. Those details, the face paint, the tattoos, they make these ancient people feel much more real.
But this unique culture and the Silk Road itself faced a massive, massive shock. The Mongol invasion. Section 6 goes into this, 1219 to 1250.
And this wasn't just a raid. This was Genghis Khan building his empire. They hit the eastern Kyrgyz territories hard. The source calls it a huge depopulating blow.
The numbers are just staggering. The source estimates maybe 1.5 million people in the western Tian Shan region beforehand.
And by 1250, it estimates the Kyrgyz population was down to about 130,000.
A tenfold reduction, just gone.
Essentially, yeah. The source calculates it as roughly a tenfold hit specifically for the Kyrgyz.
Yeah.
And beyond the human costs, infrastructure was wrecked. Irrigation systems, farming, herding, all collapsed. Cities abandoned.
It created, as the source puts it, a model new reality. It shaped politics, the economy, culture, everything for over a century. Even affected how young people saw the world.
A truly devastating period. Jumping forward quite a bit, Section 7 brings us to the 19th century and the Khanate of Kokand. Another attempt at centralized rule, this time along the eastern Silk Road roads.
Right, based in Kokand City. But they had rivals, like Bukhara, fought wars, lost Tashkent.
And they built this line of fortresses to try and hold their borders.
Their big challenge, though, was balancing power against the Russians, who were expanding rapidly. Plus, internal civil wars didn't help.
The source mentions the last ruler being abducted, but his widow actually managed to hold things together for a bit longer, delaying the Russian takeover. A small act of resistance, I suppose.
These periods, the Mongol invasion and then the Kokand Khanate's struggles, they really highlight this theme of vulnerability, don't they? External powers just rolling in and reshaping everything, cycles of conflict.
And that external pressure really peaks with Russian and then Soviet rule. Section 8 covers the Russian colonization starting in the 19th century. This basically ended the Dzungar influence in the area.
The source points to two main waves of colonization, 1860s, then more heavily in the early 20th century.
And the policies were tough. Mass deportations, especially up north where it was easier to access.
And forced secularization, trying to make nomads settle down.
Which was always going to cause resistance. There were rebellions, but, spears against rifles. It was tough. Though sometimes Russian campaigns elsewhere, like the Far East, drew troops away.
The source mentioned some last communistic attempts, maybe meaning collective resistance, leaders like Akin being put down.
There was a big rebellion in 1876 where the Kyrgyz actually declared independence briefly in one valley, Susmir, after Russian troops pulled back. Didn't last long, though.
And the source also details trouble around Kokand in the 1870s, colonists being brought in, leading to uprisings, violence. Investigations happened back in St. Petersburg, apparently, but didn't change anything on the ground.
So then comes the Soviet era, Section 9. And for Kyrgyzstan, it was a later, more difficult integration compared to some other places. Soviet power wasn't really solid until 1918.
Yeah, the source says they were starting practically from scratch, called it a very backward country, disorganized population, tough to consolidate power.
Demographically, the 1926 census showed about 790,000 Kyrgyz in the republic out of 1.2 million total. So a majority, but spread out.
And Bolshevik propaganda. It didn't land as well here, especially in the South, compared to more European parts of the USSR.
Plus, you had influential groups like Uyghurs and Tatars who already had their own established structures. Made it harder for the Soviets to just impose their system.
So this whole period, Russian colonization, early Soviet years,
Yeah.
it's about massive external force trying to reshape society, meeting resistance, and this really complex, difficult path into the Soviet system.
World War II, the Great Patriotic War, then brought another wave of massive change. Section 10 details this.
Economically, huge shifts. But the demographics first, Kyrgyzstan became a major refuge.
Yeah, 110,000 refugees by 1942 alone. That's a 40% population increase in just over a year. Plus, whole factories relocated from the front line.
So agriculture had to adapt massively. Huge push for cash crops, cotton, sugar beet, meant grain had to be brought in from Kazakhstan just to feed everyone.
And industry boomed out of necessity. Relocated factories, new training, electronics production soaring. But the source says it was brutal. Huge quotas, bad conditions, lots of plants poorly run or unfinished.
And constant pressure from Moscow to speed things up, plus that ongoing push for assimilation, Russian language, and customs.
So the war fundamentally reshaped the place, economy, people, industry, set the stage for what came next.
Which was the road to independence, really kicking off during perestroika around 85-86. Section 11 covers this.
Perestroika, Gorbachev's reforms. It opened the door for nationalist feelings that had been suppressed to come out. The intellectuals, the cultural figures started talking openly about identity, history, independence.
And organizations formed. IMA, Kyrgyzstan Democratic Movement, KDM, Kyrgyz, demanding political status, pushing a national agenda. Traditional gatherings, Kurultai, were revived too.
The state tried to keep a lid on it, talking about interethnic concord, but things were tense. There was even an anti-Kyrgyz movement among Russian speakers worried about nationalism.
Things moved fast. A rally in late '89, growing protests. The KDM went from being called separatists to a serious political force pretty quickly.
The big moment was that rally at Alatu Square in Bishkek, February 1990. Huge crowds demanding the government resign. There were clashes.
But it led to change. Later that year, a declaration of sovereignty for the Kyrgyz SSR.
And then, December 1990, the first open presidential election. The old guard resigned, Askar Akayev was elected, the Soviet Union was crumbling, and Kyrgyzstan was taking decisive steps toward independence.
It really shows how that window of opportunity, perestroika, allowed decades of suppressed feelings to just burst through. Led to movements, political change, and that complex path to actually becoming a state.
But achieving independence in '91, while huge, was just the start of a whole new set of problems. Section 12 gets into these post-independence challenges.
Yeah, the source lists them. Political instability, corruption everywhere, mass protests becoming common, deep divisions in society.
And crucially, the political shifts didn't fix the economy for most people. Widespread poverty, stagnation. The source mentions this feeling of backpedaling, almost to Soviet times for some.
There's this shared concern about common values, trust, community. But the source suggests a kind of post-Soviet hangover. People still overly reliant on the state, expecting it to provide everything.
Right. And the sudden shift away from the Soviet system broke down old ways people used to help each other out. Community support systems got complicated, trust eroded.
Section 13 digs deeper into the 1990s specifically. A time of deepening crisis, money system collapsing, economy stalling, living standards dropping, state systems falling apart. A real mess.
Stemmed right from that difficult transition, trying to switch from communism to independence and a market economy all at once. After '99, they looked for alternatives to the IMF's privatization model, which felt like a dead end, but they didn't really have a plan B.
And the source emphasizes how much those late Soviet ways of thinking and governing still lingered, influencing everything. Building a new state was just painful.
Introducing democracy talk was one thing, but in practice, decentralizing power often just meant more opposition fighting the central government. And early foreign policy involved looking for sponsors: Turkey, Iran, Arab nations.
Akayev, the first president, had a tough job, trying to build democracy in a market economy, while dealing with all this opposition, some of it from old communist figures.
These sections are so important. They show independence wasn't the finish line. It was the start of this incredibly turbulent time dealing with legacies, economic pain, political struggles. That's what shaped the early years.
And that instability didn't go away. It boiled over in the 21st century, starting with the Tulip Revolution in early 2005. Section 14 details this.
Yeah, tension had been building for a while. Accusations against President Akayev, nepotism, corruption, plus clamping down on the opposition.
The source paints a picture of the lead up to the 2005 elections. Opposition media shut down, their supporters harassed, analysts writing critical pieces, while state media attacked the opposition.
And after the revolution forced Akayev out, there was disappointment with the new elites who took over. The media itself became a powerful, manipulative force in this period.
Section 15 picks up the story from the mid-2000s to 2010. Akayev fled, and Kurmanbek Bakiev came to power after the Tulip Revolution.
But hopes faded fast. Power ended up concentrated in Bakiev's family. There was a big scandal involving profits from the U.S. airbase near Bishkek.
Right, the opposition accused his regime of pocketing the money. That airbase, there since 2001, became a real flashpoint.
Bakiev tried this multi-vector foreign policy, balancing powers. But eventually, in 2009, he announced the end of the deal with the U.S. military.
Then, another crisis point. Rising utility prices in 2008 led to protests, clashes. The government called it an attempted violent takeover.
It all came to a head in April 2010, started with peaceful economic protests.
But the next day, police fired on the crowd. Hundreds killed or wounded. Demonstrators stormed government buildings.
And Bakiev fled, first to Kazakhstan, then Belarus. End of his rule.
It shows his pattern, doesn't it? Popular anger over corruption and governance leading to massive upheaval, leadership change, often violent.
Exactly. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the contemporary situation. Section 16 looks at economic development since independence. Things were rough initially, GDP and production dropped.
But efforts were made towards market reforms. A Ministry of Industry and Trade, set up in '96, focused on agriculture and food processing, saw some growth.
Coal industry improved. Key reforms like letting the U.S. dollar trade freely in '93 helped tame inflation. Banking developed, insurance companies started appearing after '97.
The source concludes Kyrgyzstan is, on the path to a stable market economy, doing better than some other former Soviet states on inflation.
And culturally. Section 17 talks about a cultural renaissance after the Soviet Union, a really fast pace of change, especially in visual arts.
Interesting themes emerging, like a loss of the meaning of life as a national motif in art. The force calls the post-Soviet cultural shift an explosion.
And it highlights the State Museum of Fine Arts in Bishkek. Founded way back in '35, holds Western European art, Soviet stuff, but also unique Asian miniatures and manuscripts, and the best collection of Kyrgyz art, classic and contemporary.
Then Section 20 circles back to ethnic diversity, calls Kyrgyzstan the most ethnically diverse country in Central Asia, roughly 70% Kyrgyz, 15% Zizbek, 10% Russian, the main groups.
And this mix comes from history migrations, Soviet border drawing putting different groups close together. Russians often settled in the north, Kyrgyz more in the south, though many Russians have left since independence.
Section 23 looks at current social issues. Still multi-ethnic 89 groups mentioned, but big challenges around identity, nationhood.
Yeah, the source is quite critical of nation-building efforts that focus too much just on the titular Kyrgyz group. Calls it dystopian for building a truly inclusive civic nation. It says Kyrgyzstan looks tolerant on the world stage but lacks the political will to really define the status of smaller ethnic groups.
And it reiterates that demographic split, over half the population concentrated up north near the capital.
So these sections give you a snapshot of today, the economic progress and struggles, a vibrant cultural scene finding its voice, and these really complex social dynamics around ethnicity and national identity.
Let's get closer to the people. Education, youth, women. Section 21 on education and literacy. It's a bit mixed, suggests Kyrgyzstan was ahead of neighbors in some ways initially.
Right, free compulsory education declared. National schools created alongside Russian and minority language schools. Efforts to rebuild higher education after the Soviet system. Private universities allowed from '97.
But the '90s saw a big decline. Budget slashed, enrollment down, schools closing, teachers leaving. Performance dropped below Soviet levels.
Big gap between city and rural schools, discrimination against non-Kyrgyz families mentioned. It contrasts optimistic UNESCO reports with other stats showing lower literacy, like 92% in '97-'98.
Highlights challenges for ethnic minorities with language barriers. Calls it a double burden, trying to educate people while also rebuilding the whole system. Unsafe buildings, lack of materials, underpaid teachers, low success rates, especially for rural kids.
And then Section 24 focuses on youth, a huge youth population, nearly 30% age 14-29 back in Feb 2021. That's over 2.5 million young people out of 6 million total then. Numbers projected to grow, but shrink as a proportion of the total population.
Opportunities exist, sure, but big challenges remain. Unemployment, poverty, migration stopping young people participating fully. Needs collaboration, state, civil society, everyone.
And despite policies like the Youth Policy Manifesto, young people aren't really involved much in implementing them or in national decisions.
ICT helps, but unequally, cities versus rural, young women lagging behind, though there are programs since 2009 trying to help them, and significant risks of violence, domestic violence, worse during COVID, plus vulnerability for sex workers, especially from police.
Section 25 offers a really interesting perspective on women, based on a French source. It claims 95% of women prioritize fighting for rights and building a modern society over an easy life.
It calls the status of women a notable exception in Central Asia equal rights, legally anyway. And crucially, it says Kyrgyz women held high positions before the Soviets, that tradition sometimes respected women more.
Gives the example of Jam Batar, a historical heroine figure. Says women could always step up to lead in crisis, war, or economy, and men who challenged this often faltered. Claims women still hold such roles today. A powerful counter-narrative.
Finally, Section 26 looks at sports and national identity, calls sport essential for shaping public life, reflecting political identity.
And interestingly, suggests the national meaning of competing often matters more than medals. Sport as a unifier, a cultural medium, though it can also involve fear, maybe in certain contexts.
Acknowledges the debt to the Soviet sports system, but sees sport today as vital for social cohesion. Government support has improved. Good results boost pride. National awareness, that's the real value, more than just winning.
So these sections really flesh out the human side, the hopes and struggles of youth, the unique role of women, how things like education and sport weave into the national fabric.
Okay, let's zoom out one last time and place Kyrgyzstan globally. Section 18, International Relations. Inherited complexity from the USSR, influenced by neighbors, regional powers, internal goals.
Joining international bodies was crucial early on for sovereignty. First focused on neighbors, but then leaned towards distant actors, before shifting back towards Russia and Eurasian integration later.
That multi-vector policy in the mid-2000s tried to reduce reliance on Russia, reaching out to China, India, Turkey, Islamic groups. But the source argues Russia exerts heavy pressure now after recent uprisings.
Foreign policy can seem unpredictable. Under Atambayev, periods of stability, then tension after Crimea, then thawing. But relations with China yielded negative results on defense security, oddly.
Then, environmental issues, Section 19. Growing concern, new rules, but still deteriorating. Air, water pollution, resources critically depleted.
A lot is a Soviet legacy, made worse by economic problems since independence companies cutting corners on environment. Source even says environmental inspectors got cut drastically and some shifted to, well, taking money instead of enforcing rules.
Problems grouped into resource exploitation impacts, Soviet legacy, and social political factors. Specifics like deforestation, destroying protective land belts, uncontrolled gravel mining.
And the really dangerous stuff. Abandoned Soviet dumps, plants leaking contaminants, especially uranium tailings releasing radon, thorium, radium into rivers, ending up in the Fergana Valley. A serious, ongoing hazard. Section 27 uses Kyrgyz cinema as a lens on identity. Diverse films, but always grappling with what it means to be Kyrgyz.
Some filmmakers worry about globalization erasing culture. Others want to promote a distinct Kyrgyz worldview internationally. Post-Soviet anxieties about crumbling cultural identity are a key theme.
Films explore identity in three ways, the source says. Core things like nation, language, nomadism, contemporary life tradition versus modernity, new wealth, nostalgia, and traditional structures like clans, kin not shown as entirely negative.
And finally, Section 28 pulls it all together, positions Kyrgyzstan as this new country navigating between big powers.
A place where different civilizations, Turkic, Mongolian, Islamic, Buddhist, coexist, sometimes clashing, but all part of the mix.
Calls it the quintessence of Kyrgyz history and memory, a future of the present. A place worth investing in for its well-being.
Highlights its geopolitical importance, resources, yes, but especially water. Critical for the whole region.
But contrast this with a deeper importance, its culture, its people, safeguarding values. Calls it hallowed land of the Silk Road, sacrosanct.
Emphasizes the environment again, holding 2/3 of Central Asia's clean water, a birthplace of salutiferous life, cradle of traditions, philosophy, art, science, blended with nature.
A perfect chance to invest in human heritage. Says civilization takes centuries, suggests that despite conflicts, these cultures ultimately appreciated each other's beauty and moral value.
And the conclusion ends with this vision. Kyrgyzstan as a future, a living legacy where 18 million peaceful people share a treasurable fountain of compassion and creation. And it's worth noting, earlier the source cited 6 million people in 2021. This 18 million figure might be symbolic or refer to a broader diaspora. We're just relaying what's in the source.
So what an incredible journey through this brief history of Kyrgyzstan. We've gone from its stunning, defining mountains through millennia of history, early settlers, the Silk Road nexus, devastating invasions, Russian and Soviet dominance.
Right, then the turbulent path to independence, the struggles to build a nation, economic challenges, political upheavals, right up to contemporary culture, society, and its place in the world today.
It's so clear how geography shaped everything and how these deep historical layers, ancient and recent, are absolutely woven into the present-day reality.
Mm-hmm. The legacies are undeniable. They're part of the ongoing story.
Exactly. So considering all the history, the geography, the ongoing efforts to forge an identity and stable future from such a complex past, what do you think is the single most crucial factor shaping Kyrgyzstan's path right now?
That's really the big question this deep dive leaves us wrestling with, isn't it?
It is indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope exploring this source material together has given you some fresh insights and a richer appreciation for this truly remarkable Central Asian nation.